What do you call a person with an anxious attachment style and a new phone number? Hi, I'm Angel of the Artist, aka ZGALA the Art Angel, and this is the Authentic Action Podcast. Welcome. Today, I'm going to be talking about, you might have guessed it, attachment styles and communication and relationships. Specifically, I'm going to share some red flags and green flags for healthy/unhealthy relationships, as well as some phrases that I'm practicing and that you might find helpful to practice or to keep your ears open for if other people are using versions of these phrases that are tools that we can use to help improve our communication or increase the effectiveness of our communication in our relationships. So, and last but not least, I'm going to talk a little bit about how to address our own dysfunctionality when we realize that maybe we're the toxic one or we're the one who is um, not securely attached and therefore creating an unhealthy pattern in our relationships. Put your hand in the air, turn your hand around, and pat yourself on the back if that's you and you recognize yourself in that statement. That's definitely me. So that's what led me to this topic. And yeah, let's just dive into it, shall we? Attachment styles. You may or may not have heard about the standard kind of framework of attachment styles as it's just one lens, a way of looking at our relationships, but it can be very helpful. And I should point out that it is just a lens. It's not like these attachment styles really define us completely or um, necessarily, 100% accurately. Certainly, some of us are, um, mostly secure with little glimmers of one of these other attachment styles, and some of us are more predominantly one style or another. I happen to be a fairly chaotic attachment style person, and I have done a lot of work to get more secure. And in some of my relationships, I am relatively securely attached. And in most of my relationships in my life, I've been, somewhere on the spectrum further away from securely attached. Um, it wasn't until I was in my early 50s that I realized I am literally on the autism spectrum, and that plays a huge role in my abilities and inabilities to communicate and connect with other humans. So, um, this is one of the reasons that it has become a passion of mine or a special interest of mine, you could say. Um, but another reason is just that we are social creatures. We're all social animals. Human beings were born, defenseless and dependent on caretakers, and that makes us wired for these connections between other human beings. And also, human civilization has thrived to the degree that it has because of our ability to communicate and collaborate and, um, yeah, help each other and figure out what each other needs and wants and help each other get that for one another. That's really at the core of human civilization. So, um, I think learning to communicate effectively and learning how to be securely attached in our relationships so that we're not spending so much energy in miscommunication and then in repairing damage that's been done through those miscommunications or the responses to those miscommunications when feelings get hurt. And again, personal to me because I have spent a fair amount of my life in dysfunctional cycles and patterns. And I would say it was in my 30s that I really became aware that these patterns must be mine because they were reoccurring in relationships with different people. And yet, it wasn't until my mid 40s that I started to really do what I would call the work of actively working on finding phrases and trying to shift my language and my thinking, and journaling every day again like I used to when I was younger, and really doing that work to figure out um, how I can have healthier relationships, how I can not be the one that's blowing up my relationships on a regular basis because I don't know how to effectively communicate and or because I don't feel securely attached. So let's get into the attachment styles as they've been defined. I should know the person's name, but I don't. But if you're interested, you could look that up. It's pretty well documented and now been discussed a lot. And again, I want to reiterate, this is just one lens. And like all lenses, it's not the whole entire thing. It's not the end all be all. It's not going to tell you everything you ever needed to know, but it can be very helpful for illuminating certain aspects of our relationships and our attachment. And the two main styles are really, there's kind of three or even four, depending on how you think of it. But the main ones are usually talked about the most are anxious attachment style and avoidant attachment style. And these two styles tend to attract each other and go around and around in a loop. So if you're a person who is predominantly anxious in your attachments, like you want to know, you need a lot of affirmation about a person's feelings for you, or you get worried if you haven't heard from a person in a short amount of time or what seems to you like a longer amount of time. You don't have good emotional permanence, as one of my favorite video YouTubers, Anna Akana, was last year talking about, but I just recently reviewed her video. Anyway, if you don't have a good secure sense that someone could have feelings that are still there even if they're not communicating them to you, and or if you've had past experiences where you've been abandoned or you have, trauma due to neglect and abandonment, you may have what is typically called an anxious attachment style. And that might lead you to need extra affirmation from your partners. And often what happens is people with this attachment style, if they haven't done the work to become conscious of this and aware of it and consciously navigate that in a healthy way, they will tend to attract a person with an avoidant attachment style. And a person with an avoidant attachment style will tend to be aloof and non-committal, sometimes more extreme to be like ghosting and gaslighting and stonewalling, some of those more toxic behaviors. I was just listening to a comedian talk about those two attachment styles, and she said the avoidant attachment style is also known as the cool ones. And I thought that was funny because there's certainly a spark of truth in that. And it reminded me of how I have embodied both of those attachment styles at different times in different relationships. And I suspect many of us do. Like if you end up being around someone with an extreme version of one of those styles, you might automatically start to embody more of the opposite style. And it could even be a very healthy response to keep a little healthy distance there. So, I think it's important to remember that we don't always need to get closer to everyone. Sometimes it's important to distinguish when it's good to get away from someone or release someone or, um, yeah, to end a relationship. I recently have come through yet another iteration of this with a group that I'm in. So it's a complex basket of relationships. But the bottom line is that for over a year, maybe even pushing 5 years, I've been aware that this relationship isn't keeping up with the types of relationship that I want to cultivate in my in my life. And I keep showing up to this basket of relationships with my bandmates in one particular group and finding myself regularly upset because they're unable to give me the affirmation or unable to meet me in that secure attachment style of a healthy friendship. Um, that I'm craving, and the unhealthy, insecure aspects of me keep looking for that affirmation and then getting angry, and we keep going through this increasingly toxic cycle of of stonewalling, of expressing anger, of not feeling heard and seen, of trying to gaslight or brush it under the rug. I'm talking about now the dynamic interplay of more than one side of this. But the point that I'm trying to get at is that ultimately it is up to each of us to maintain our own boundaries and to realize when we're engaging in relationships that aren't serving us well. And sometimes, like in the case with these bandmates, sometimes it's a relationship we've invested a lot of time and energy into, and we would like to be able to salvage or continue or renew. And so it's worth trying to find new language, to find new connection, to find, sometimes getting in a new environment, something can shift in that dynamic. And really, though, the one of the main keys or the main key of that is to start by taking responsibility for that yourself. Because if you're trying to blame or shame someone else into behaving in a certain way or changing the way that they're interacting with you, oh, I can attest you're just going to be sorely frustrated, to say the least, to put it mildly. Um, and again, speaking from experience, ask me how I know. Um, yeah, I have many examples of times when I have gotten into relationships and they've started off positive and then they've gone negative because of my unhealthy habits or their unhealthy habits, or often the combination of our unhealthy habits together. And then I have other examples of relationships that have gone beautifully positive. Um, and when I reflect on the differences, there's two key elements that come to mind, and one of them is that ongoing aspect that I was talking about of noticing when things aren't quite right and trying to adjust and correct along the way. And if it's a healthy relationship, if you have a friendship um, for a long time, there's bound to be misunderstandings. But if it's healthy, you can say, hey, that thing you said um, sounded to me like you were saying X, Y, or Z, and then your friend might say, "Oh, you know what? I'm glad you brought that up. Actually didn't even think of that, or I didn't realize how that sounded, or I remember how that kind of sounded weird, but I'm sorry I didn't address it." Or, however the little nuanced details are. When you have a healthy relationship, then you can talk about things and you can come to a new level of understanding. And like in the example that I've been using with my bandmates, there's at least one of my bandmates, or actually two of the three other bandmates, are amicable to trying to gain new understanding and talk things through. Now, of course, those are the two that I have not a personal misunderstanding with. So the misunderstanding was only in the context of they were confused about what was happening between me and this other person. And this other person and I have really been at an impasse for quite a while. And even though we've had some attempts of communication, my tendency is to be aggressive and um, lash out, and that tends to make this person's avoidant tendencies come to the forefront. And somewhat pretty understandably, he's like, I'm not gonna respond to someone who's being upset. And then when I've calmed down and tried to, I've apologized and said, hey, this is still worth trying to talk through. So can we meet for coffee and talk? Can we find a way of trying to communicate? Do you want to communicate with me? He has not responded. And so that leaves me, again, I tend to then fall into that anxious attachment style in response to his avoidant attachment style, and start to feel very insecure and like, oh, you must have never liked me. And then again, I lash out because I have this little chaotic, it's not little, I don't mean to underplay it. I have quite a significant amount of complex PTSD and other issues in my body. So, I have tried to learn over the years to express that in healthy ways to people that I interact with, especially if I'm going to engage to any degree in a partnership, of any extent. And that brings me to the topic of some statements. I know my heater might be on right now and loud. I hope it's not too loud. And I am going to be staring over here at my computer and look at some statements that I had an AI large language model help me with earlier when I was asking, what are some phrases that people with avoidant and um, avoidant, that's anxious. Another word for that is insecure, or um, yeah, I said that kind of jumbled up. Let me back up. Insecure or anxious is one attachment style that I was asking about, and avoidant, or as the comedian called it, the cool, detached attachment style. Um, and so when I asked AI for some phrases to help me think about and potentially practice and share with you, these are some phrases that I got that I want to share because I think it's very helpful to pre-think, especially if you recognize that you have one of these patterns. If you can kind of rehearse in your mind or actually even out loud on paper, all these things are helpful so that when you're on the spot, when you're either in a new relationship, planting the seeds of a new relationship, or when you're in an already established relationship and you see something starting to go amiss, these are some tools that you could use to help course correct and to help plant the seeds of healthy relationships. So for people with avoidant attachment styles, you might say, if you're needing more time and space to process something, you might say, I'm feeling a little overwhelmed right now and need some time to myself to process. I'll connect to you later. That little last bit helps the other person know that you're intending to come back to it if you are. Another one might be, I need a little space right now. It's not about you. I just need to recharge. Can we talk about it in 30 minutes or some other time frame? Giving it a time frame, again, helps give the other person the reassurance that you are coming back to the conversation or that you intend to complete the conversation, that you're not just running away because you need some more space. Here's another one if you're needing more space, which is, my mind is spinning right now, or I'm finding it hard to think right now. So I need to step away for a bit to think more clearly, or can we table this conversation for a little while and come back to it later? I want to mention that I had a partner who used to use this one. It's a fairly textbook comment, and it got to where it became triggering. Can we table this conversation for now? Because we wouldn't end up coming back to it. And so if you're going to use one of these phrases where you say you're coming to come back to it and you're going to be non-specific, like in a while or sometime later, then you need to be very careful to come back to it fairly quickly. And it's helpful if you can, instead of being vague like that, if you can add a time frame. If it's a relationship with someone that you really care about and you want to, a relationship you care about and you want to cultivate more connection in. So um, some phrases to use if you're feeling just uncomfortable with intense emotions that the other person is expressing and you need to like tamp them down a little bit or chill it out a little bit. You could say, I'm feeling a little uncomfortable with the intensity of this conversation. Can we dial it back a bit? You could say, I'm not sure I can engage effectively with this conversation when it's this emotional. Could we take a break? You could say, I want to understand your feelings, but I can't absorb them when they're presented in this way. Can we slow down and try something a little bit different? These are all helpful potential phrases, and I encourage you to think about how you might modify them to help you, and also to realize that there's not ever going to be like one perfect phrase for all situations always. It's about, having like a toolbox of these phrases and parts of phrases. And really, the more you practice them, the more you will start to get the idea of them, which is about this expressing your own needs with I statements, and then if you can, reassuring the other person that you still want to connect, but you're, and again, if possible, giving them a time frame to come back. So some statements, if someone is trying to engage in conflict, you could say, I'm noticing we're not on the same page right now. Let me take a little time to get there and I'll come back to this conversation later. Or, I'm not trying to ignore you. I'm trying to figure out how to handle this conversation better. Let's talk later. Or, I am shutting down. I need to step away for a little while before I can be present and productive. And as you can hear in those statements, there's a wide degree of how, the energy behind them, how open or closed they are. And the other person's filters they're going to go through the other person's filters and be received in ways that you probably can't always predict at all or understand. So know that you could just do your best, and probably sometimes you're going to be imperfect, or sometimes even if you're like perfect, the other person isn't going to respond perfectly. And that's just like, as long as you're doing your best to show up as a good person and communicate effectively, then I don't know what more any of us could ask from each other. So um, if you're trying to reassure your partner, your friend, your colleague, while also setting boundaries, and you have an avoidant attachment style that's dominant, you might say something like, it's not that I don't care. It's just that I need a little distance to process my feelings. I do want to work through this with you, though. Or you could say, I need time and space, but that doesn't mean I'm not invested in this relationship or the situation. I will come back to this. You could say, my need for space isn't a rejection of you. I care about you, and I want to work this out when I'm more grounded. That one almost makes me cry. Interesting. And I encourage you to notice, like I try to, when you have an emotional surge, like I just did, there's usually a clue in there. I'm just gonna like put a little pinky finger asterisk in that for myself and try to come back to it. Um, which is a little tricky because it's written over there on my computer and not a place I can scribble on. But when you notice an emotional rise like that and you don't know exactly what it was in a response to, see if you can come back to that later and dig into it a little bit and uncover something that you might not have realized about your own emotional reactivity. So let's move on for now into, well, I want to mention key considerations for avoidant attachment styles is um, sorry, I got distracted by that not making quite sense, and I'm going to skip that part for now and come back to it a little bit later. Let's move on to phrases for people with anxious attachment styles to use. So if you're a person who knows that you have or tends to have a more anxious attachment style, then these are some phrases that might help you in your relationships. If you're needing to express your needs and worries directly, you could say something like, "When I don't hear from you, I start to worry. Could you give me a quick check-in when you get a chance?" Or you could say, "I feel a bit insecure when in said situation. Can we talk about it?" You could say, "I'm feeling a bit anxious right now. Could we connect soon?" You could say, "I'm having a hard time with the silence and I'm worried you're upset with me." That's one that, again, could be, in my experience, could be triggering to an avoidant person if you don't have a strong commitment to the relationship. So you need to use these with, with your own filters of judgment and tailor them to be appropriate for specific relationships, obviously. If you are a person with an anxious attachment style and you're trying to communicate your need for connection and reassurance, some phrases that might help you are, "I really value our connection and I'm hoping we can talk through this together." Or, "It would mean a lot to me if we could spend some quality time soon. I've been feeling a little disconnected lately." Or, "I need reassurance that we're okay." Or if it's a little more intense, "I'm feeling very worried that I've upset you. Could we talk through what is happening?" And it occurs to me, see, if I had used one of those phrases earlier in my conflict with my bandmate, who was extremely avoidant, and I already knew that, I probably could have avoided pushing him away further, because instead of using one of those like those more effective phrases for communicating my need for connection and reassurance, I jumped straight to um, defensive, blaming, shaming type of language, which understandably just pushed him more deeply into his avoidant pattern. So, um, here's some helpful phrases for people in an anxious attachment style to express vulnerability without demanding or blaming. "I'm feeling a little sensitive right now and would appreciate some extra gentleness." Or, "When things are unclear, it makes me feel insecure. Can we try to be as explicit as possible?" Or, "I know that I can sometimes react emotionally, but I'm working on expressing my feelings more effectively. I am scared right now. My sensitivity is heightened right now, so please don't take my reaction personally." I did try a couple versions of these ones, but I think I tried them a little bit late in the conversation and had already escalated his reaction. And he is younger than me and doesn't have, the not that being younger would necessarily mean a person wouldn't have the skills that I have, but he has not put in the years of work that I've put in to try to develop some of these skills. And so I try to give a lot of grace for that whenever I have a breakdown of communication. And all I can do is hope that other people have that grace for me, because I am certainly not perfect, as I've already mentioned, and I will talk about more in a little bit here. So, if you're feeling triggered and you're wanting to pull someone in closer and you have that anxious attachment style, and you have a commitment to a relationship. Again, this is an important distinction because if you don't, then you need to probably check yourself if you're feeling anxious. This could be limerence or a form of complex PTSD, which is a whole nother topic for another day. But I know, ask me how I know about that. Anyway, if you have a committed relationship with a person who is wanting to maintain that attachment with you, and you've talked a little about this, and you know that you have an anxious style and they have an avoidance style, then these phrases might be helpful to you. You could say, I'm afraid I'm afraid we are disconnecting. Can we work on connecting again? Or I'm feeling very alone. Can we find some time to sit together? Or I'm feeling triggered right now and I need a little reassurance. Can you help? Maybe could I get a hug? I added that little part. I've tried to tell my last partner who did have some level of commitment with me, how far a hug can go when a person is feeling anxious. When my system is dysregulated, a hug can literally just calm it down. There doesn't even need to be any words or any more assurance than that physical felt assurance of a person physically holding you. So, um, I should mention in the midst of all these statements that those physical cues like leaving or like giving someone a hug or like um rolling your eyes, showing disdain versus staying with your eyes connected and really showing that you trying to show that you care. Those signs go a long way as well and are often even more powerful than the verbal cues that what we say is often an overlay on our actions and how we are feeling and making each other feel. So I think that's very important to keep in mind. Um, I'm looking back at my notes here because I had such a great conversation with the large language models earlier today about all of this stuff. And I think some things to keep in mind that are helpful if you have a partner who has um, one of these more extreme attachment styles is that even though you don't have to know a person's attachment style and they don't have to know yours, it can be very helpful to think about that a little bit and, if possible, ask some questions about past relationships or your current relationship, how how things have been through that lens of this attachment style, because then you can gain more understanding of each other. You can start to predict certain things and head off certain uh, dysfunctional patterns in your relationship. If you're committed and you're really wanting to improve your relationship. And I want to mention and stress a committed relationship isn't only like a marriage or an intimate sexual relationship. It can be like a bandmate, like I mentioned. It can be a business partnership. It can be a family member, a parent or a sibling. It can be a friend. There's many, many different types of relationships where we might want to have some level of commitment and a healthier level of communication. So looking at a person through that attachment style can be helpful, but it isn't the only thing and it isn't always necessary. And it is important to keep in mind that it's not always a good idea to just go asking people questions about their attachment style. Sometimes it is. It just depends on the relationship. So I'll just throw that in there. Um, but knowing someone's style can help you start to tailor your communication, can help you have more empathy and compassion for them if they have a tendency or a pattern that seems toxic to you. You might start to understand that it's not that they are a bad person or they are, toxic overall, or even that they don't, mean the things that they say in different contexts. They may get triggered into a certain style, a certain pattern, and not really have the skills to get out of it. I do feel like that's what's happened with my bandmate and I, because we've known each other about a year. We've had a decent bandmate relationship. And then when things got a little bit more personal, I got more anxious about our relationship and he got more avoidant about our relationship, which quickly escalated into us not being able to communicate effectively. And, hopefully we will be able to work it out. But if not, it's sort of one of those things in life. Sometimes you realize that you don't want to do the work to have a relationship with someone, or that you um, don't feel like you can have a healthy relationship with them because of your conflicting attachment styles. If you tend to be a very avoidant person and they tend to be a very anxious person, or vice versa, that's just a recipe for a very toxic dynamic. So, if both parties aren't willing to bring that more toward the middle, um, then it might not be worth the effort. Again, depending on the relationship and the context. Um, I want to talk a little bit about, what about when you realize you're the toxic one? I think it's so easy to always be thinking it's the other person, but the reality is that it takes two to tango, as they say. Really, we generally meet people and get engaged with people who match us on some energetic level, in our relationships. And so if you find that you're having a similar reoccurring pattern, instead of just identifying and pinpointing what the other person has as far as an attachment style, or as far as flaws and traits, it might be a lot more useful to look at what are your own dysfunctional patterns that you're bringing to the table. Like I was just mentioning with my bandmate, like as you start to untangle these things, you will start to see that none of us is all bad or all good. All of us have these dynamics, and there's always reasons behind our dynamics. Often they go back to, even all the way back to infancy. So I have a lot of abandonment issues from neglect and abuse in my infancy and childhood that lead to my chaotic and often veering toward the avoidant attachment style. I say often because, if you put me in an arena, so to speak, with a very anxious attachment styled person, I will quickly take that avoidant role and be the more cool one and aloof one. Um, and when I was younger, that was much more extreme actually, and I was um, avoidant to the point of being cruel in many of my relationships actually, and that's not fun to admit or reflect on or remember, but it's very, very true. And I think it is important to reflect on now and then and remember, because it helps me put in context like my current conflict with this younger person, and remember that usually we're all doing the best we can with what we have from where we are. And sometimes that's just crap. Sometimes we just have, a real shit upbringing, or we just haven't practiced much, or we just haven't ever even heard of these skills or thought about it, or we've just practiced really unhealthy dynamics so much that they're so ingrained that they just, like these less healthy phrases pop out of our mouths at the wrong time or before we can even help it. Um, so I just want to acknowledge that. And now to talk about, I'm looking at my notes here, and it's talking about unhealthy attachments and how sometimes it is important to just unattach when it really becomes, a toxic cycle where we're hurting each other. It's important to recognize that and walk away. And sometimes you can walk away with one of those phrases of like, hey, this is important to me, so I would like to come back to this later. And sometimes we can't. With some of my bandmates right now, where we're standing is, we just got through the holiday season, and I said, it's been really great playing with you guys. I really hope we can play together in the future. But right now, I am trying to work through this miscommunication, and I am not sure how to navigate that. And if I can't find a different place in this relationship with this person I had the miscommunication with, then I don't think I can show up and be fully present without being activated in my own past trauma responses, basically, and then creating an unpleasant experience for everyone. So, I think that's been the best I could do. It's certainly not perfect. It's definitely messy, and I'm still sifting over here for the part of my notes that I was talking about, which is, not that I can't just talk about it without my notes, but um, oh, let's talk briefly about red flags and green flags. So red flags for unhealthy communication. These are just some things to look out for in yourself and in others that might help you become more aware of, again, phrases that you might be using or phrases others, not just phrases, but behaviors. So red flags or indicators that you might be in an unhealthy relationship or you might be evoking unhealthy communication techniques and tools are constant criticism and blaming, finding fault in the other person, using accusatory language like you always or you never, avoiding taking responsibility for your own actions or feelings. Passive aggression, which this is a buzzword that gets, a bad rap these days because it's been overused, but I think it's valid, and that is expressing negative feelings indirectly through sarcasm, the silent treatment, backhanded compliments, or other subtle forms of hostility. Dismissive and or dismissiveness and minimizing, invalidating the other person's feelings or experiences, telling them they're overreacting or downplaying their concerns. Now, I get a lot of this, and it could be because I tend to overreact. So I definitely do tend to overreact sometimes. So it's important to understand there are nuances to all of these and not just latch right onto one and go like, oh yeah, I know that's what the person is doing. Because if you find yourself doing that, that's a good cue. But again, you might want to reflect that back to yourself and see, how are you doing that? That's usually the better question. How am I doing this? And how can I become more aware of it and choose a better path? That's what I've been trying to do anyway. Yelling or verbal abuse. This is pretty much always a clue that there's an unhealthy communication. It's never a healthy way of communicating. Although some families, engage in a much louder level of discourse without becoming uncomfortable, and then other families don't. So again, there's nuances, there's a range. Gaslighting, manipulating another person into questioning their own reality, memories, or sanity. This is part of what I feel like I'm hypersensitive to because of past relationships, but is also what triggered me in this current relationship. Is like a little glimmer of that, and I'm on it right away of like, do not do that to me. And I have tried to communicate that effectively, but as I mentioned already, I think I did overreact or react more aggressively than was appropriate for the situation. Controlling communication is another one of those indicators of unhealthy communication. So, a person who attempts to dictate what the other person can say, who they can talk to, or how they can express themselves. Avoidance and stonewalling, refusing to communicate, shutting down during conversations, or completely withdrawing from the relationship when disagreements arise. And this is one I hate when other people do, and I also do a fair amount myself. Um, Lack of active listening, not paying attention, interrupting, or being preoccupied with your own thoughts while the other person is speaking. Yeah, I definitely have been guilty of that one as well. Bringing up past mistakes, also me. Constantly referencing old conflicts or grievances as a means of criticizing or manipulating the other person. Now, I don't know if I do it as a means of criticizing or manipulating, but I often feel like I haven't resolved old conflict, especially like with my mother. And I would say it's because we haven't resolved it. But I've had other people tell me that I'm bringing up the past and that that's a problem for them. So I'm just aware of that, but I haven't really found a resolution yet. But I guess my resolution is that I now try to say to people, like, I'm the type of person that needs to resolve conflict. So I need us to come back to this and resolve it, or I won't be able to sleep well, and I will tend to hold on to it for a really long time. And if we can't resolve it, then we need to agree to disagree and put it in like a container of unresolved things it's been acknowledged as that, and not just move on like it was resolved when it wasn't. For me, that's I think it's a little bit one of my quirks, but it's something I've realized that is true about myself and is helpful if I can express to others. So, um, emotional blackmail, last but not least, in the list of red flags or indicators of unhealthy communication. And that seems like it should be obvious, but actually, I think this is actually used subtly quite a lot, and we don't always realize when we're doing it to others or when it's being done to us. And that's using guilt, threats, or manipulation to get what we want or control other people's behavior. And yeah, these red flags are warning signs that indicate unhealthy patterns and dynamics. Any one of these red flags doesn't necessarily mean you should just throw out the whole relationship or that there's no hope for it or that that's a toxic relationship or any of that. These are things to look out for, and they can create a climate of fear and insecurity and distrust, and they often stem from a lack of empathy or emotional maturity, and they um, they stem from a lack of emotional maturity or um, also called emotional immaturity. I'm reading my notes, it's written funny there. And they can stem from an unwillingness to take responsibility for your own actions. So they can signify a lack of respect for the other person, which is what I'm feeling in my present conflict that I mentioned. And the presence of these flags can severely damage the connection and create an environment where authentic and healthy communication is not possible. It's crucial to recognize and address these behaviors, whether in yourself or others, in order to foster healthier interactions. Unhealthy patterns of communication create distance and resentment and an inability to work through conflicts constructively. These behaviors erode the foundation of trust and security in relationships. And I would argue over time they erode civilization itself, society, families, our ability as individuals and as groups to trust each other and to have secure, healthy relationships is really a foundational aspect of civilization. So it's one of the reasons I'm so passionate about it. And probably a reason that I tend to get overreactive about it because I tend to start taking it as like a life and death situation. And so it's important to remember that, again, these are all on a spectrum. Let's get into green flags or indicators of healthy relationships. Much more pleasant conversation topic. And what I like to focus on. So active listening, this is a skill we can probably all use to improve. And I think we all know what it feels like when someone is really paying full attention to us, making eye contact, asking clarifying questions to show that they've been listening, and summarizing to show that they understand what we're saying. It feels so good, doesn't it? To feel seen, to feel understood. And that's what active listening can get us in our relationships. It's really a great connection, intimacy builder, right? I statements, expressing your feelings and needs using I statements. So, like, I feel hurt when, or I need, rather than blaming and accusing with you statements like you make me feel, or you always do this. Those are bad. Use the I feel hurt when, the I, bring it back to you. Um, and recognizing when you hear other people using those kind of statements, that's a nice green flag to recognize that they may have done some work on how to communicate effectively and cultivate healthy relationships, or maybe they just naturally have those skills, which is a beautiful thing too. Um, Empathy and validation is another green flag. So acknowledging and validating another person's feelings and perspectives, even if you don't agree with them, that's a skill um, that I think I've improved a lot. Of course, there's more room for that, but being a massage therapist helped me cultivate that skill quite a bit, I would say. Respectful tone and language. This is when I still have a lot of room for improvement. Speaking calmly and respectfully, avoiding name calling, insults, or other verbally aggressive language. It's funny to hear myself admit that this is an area I have a lot of room for improvement, and it certainly is true. Um, but I should admit right next to that that it's also an area that bothers me the most when other people like use aggressive language, especially during conflict. Now, I'll use it flippantly in play, but sometimes that could be actually like a passive aggressive thing, right? Not always, but again, it gets complicated. But I know that there's a relationship between the things that bother me the most when I see other people do them and the things that I'm still working through in myself. So I'm just starting to work through that in myself. And so I'm just starting to see how it bothers me so much in other people because I've been denying that about myself for a long period of time. Clear and direct communication, expressing yourself in clear, honest, and straightforward manners without being vague or passive aggressive. That's a green flag. Willingness to compromise, being open to finding solutions that work for both of you rather than insisting on your way or shutting down the conversation. This is one I think I've also made significant strides of improvement on and will continue to do. Taking responsibility, owning your mistakes, and apologizing when necessary without making excuses or shifting blame. Another one. Yeah, I'm going to give myself a little kudos for making progress. Not that I'm perfect. Focus on the present, addressing current issues without bringing up past grievances that are not relevant to the current situation. The ability to pause and regulate. I'm working on this and getting better, regulating my emotions when they're running high, taking a pause, recognizing when my heart's racing and my voice is getting louder and I'm starting to get aggressive. And instead of just leaning more heavily into that, learning to cool down and take a break and pause the conversation, come back to it later. It's very difficult for me, and I know for many of us who have developed a pattern habit of feeling maybe feeling victimized, feeling like there's been some wrong, some injustice, and then pushing back against it aggressively, which can be good in the right context, but can also be devastating in the wrong context or when it's implemented to the wrong degree. Non-verbal congruence. So aligning your verbal communication with your body language, like making eye contact, having a relaxed posture, conveying honesty and authenticity. These are all green flags and indicators of healthy communication in your relationships. And these are all things that we can all probably improve on. There's room for improvement in all these areas for most of us, I would argue. Green flags represent healthy communication that fosters understanding, communication, and mutual respect. These behaviors create safe and nurturing environments where partners can feel valued and heard. They demonstrate emotional intelligence, self-awareness, and a commitment to building healthy and fulfilling relationships. Green flags signify a desire to understand and connect rather than to blame and distance. They also require practice, intention, and a willingness to grow. Like I mentioned, I don't think any of us has really actually perfected any of these all the time in all situations. Healthy communication creates stronger relationships because it prioritizes mutual understanding, safety, and respect. And when these communication behaviors are present, relationships have a stronger foundation of trust, compassion, and genuine connection. All that kind of seems obvious, and then also worth revisiting a little bit. I know this is getting super long now, and I wanted to touch on taking personal responsibility for the garden of our own relationships, planting seeds that nourish our relationships, pulling up the weeds of unhealthy patterns when we recognize them in ourselves and in our relationships broadly. Um, all this takes a little bit of a nuanced dynamic dance. It's really an ongoing dance that I don't think any of us really ever masters completely, but I think is worth all of us trying to get better at always. So, as I mentioned, I think it's really actually a crucial aspect of a healthy society. And just to kind of wrap it up as quickly as possible, um, by taking personal accountability for these aspects of ourselves, by looking for those aspects in ourselves, especially if we recognize a big emotional flare in ourselves in response to someone else, that's a good clue that we have work to do in ourselves. So, um, and then last but not least, using self-compassion. When we can give ourselves grace, it actually helps us give others grace as well. So I think it's a very important practice. It's one I've been implementing for myself quite a lot. And I encourage you to try on for yourself if you haven't already been implementing it for yourself as well. I'm going to wrap this up here because I'm realizing it has been extremely long. I want to remind you that we're all prone and capable of evoking more cynicism and more negative red flag type of traits. However, if we indulge in that too often, then our relationships suffer, our society suffers, our own bodies suffer. So I think it's important to always be bringing ourselves back to that more positive outlook, that aiming for more positive relationships. And if we find that we're in a relationship where we just can't bring it to a more positive space, then to recognize that it's okay to put it aside for now, to say, hey, I'm gonna not put my energy into this anymore because it's just creating suffering in me and in those around me. And instead, I'm gonna give that time and energy to relationships where I do have some reciprocity or commitment to make it a healthier relationship. Um, mhm. The punchline of what do you call a person with an anxious attachment style and a new phone number? A text bombing time bomb. I know it's not that funny. I wanted to follow it up with a better joke, but I can't read my own writing. What did the person with a secure attachment style bring to their first date? A nice cozy blanket so they could keep themselves feeling safe and secure. Doesn't make any sense either, does it? Well, there you have it. Not everything always makes sense. So there, you're welcome. This has been an extra long episode of the Authentic Action Podcast. And I didn't mention our sponsors at all. That is the Authentic Action Academy over in the school community, where we are gathering ideas for the future of education, and the Sleeping Dragons Company, where you can find hard to find exotic essential oils and self care items and other cosmetic and beauty supplies to awaken and inspire your creative spirit. You can find Sleeping Dragons over on Etsy or by typing in www.sleepingdragonsco.com. I'm Angel Lily. Thanks for stopping by. Thanks for being you. I'll be seeing you soon. Ciao for now.